So we're talking about gathering information. We're talking about data. We're talking about how we look at it. I kind of have a less scientific take maybe on how I want to talk about data. And I want to talk about how we gather it from each other, how it works for us interpersonally, and how our interactions give us the data we need to create value and to make our relationships and our projects and the things that we work on valuable and what we intended them to be at the end. So I've entitled it What, and it's all about questions and the way we ask them. And when I've told people that they're like, oh, you're doing a TEDx, what are you going to talk about? And I'm like, questions. And I get really blank stares back, like, well, what are you going to talk about? So we'll get to that piece, but here's kind of what inspired it. It all started with a crash. So last summer, on Friday the 13th, August the 13th, my husband got in a head-on collision in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They had just been climbing the Tetons, and it's an all-night deal, and then you get up the next morning, and you hike down during the day, so I think they summit when the sun's coming up. On their way down, they'd taken a nap in the meadow, so they felt pretty good. Went down, got in their truck, and within 15 minutes of getting in the truck, the individual that was driving the car had fallen asleep at the wheel on a 2-lane highway, and he veered over in his lane. And here's a tip for y'all that I learned from the highway patrolman. If you are ever faced with a car that is crossing over the line, say you're on a 2-lane highway, odds are this is the person that's falling asleep. This is you, right? This person is going to wake up. So if you want to go this way to miss them, bad idea. Always cut to the right. And that's exactly what happened. Here they come. Here's my husband Mark's truck falling asleep. Here's this guy veered around. And so they had a head-on collision because the driver of Mark's car did wake up and corrected. This is the truck. And in a really creepy way, my husband pointed out to me, see that little white T-shirt in the back seat and the EMS holding up ahead? That's Mark. And he was life-flighted from Jackson Hole to Salt Lake City because he needed a neurosurgeon. He had broken his back. In essence, the seatbelt kind of shredded through his midsection. So they put him on a plane. This accident happened around 6 o'clock in the evening, and I got a phone call around 8, letting me know that this had happened, and they were life-flighting him to Salt Lake and over to IMC. The first thing that he said to me when I saw him in the ER, and they were about to take him back for surgery, was, ask your questions, because he couldn't. He was in a world that he had no control over, and the thing that I could do for him at that time was to ask really great questions and to advocate for him. So I moved from the mode of being the very worried wife, because we were faced with life and death at this time, into a crazy question-asking advocate. I asked everything you could think of, and then I asked the doctor if there's anything else I should ask. And they were so patient and good with me. But turns out, it's the right thing to do. So in the following months, I had read a couple of books. There's a guy named Dr. Atul Gawande, and he wrote a book called Better, and then one called The Checklist Manifesto. And to me, he may tell you his books are about different things, but for me, his books were all examples and all examples of how we could overhaul medicine and how we can do things better without spending a lot of money on research and development and patents, but in simply asking better questions and saving money and saving lives. And his examples were so compelling. So as I read, if your doctor will just ask you a random question in your visit, whether it's that you're a Red Sox fan or that you've got 3 kids or that you just got back from a vacation in Italy, your standard of patient care will go up because you're no longer just one of the faces that he saw, one of 10 faces that he saw in an hour of who he's treating. But next time he sees you, he's like, oh, you're the Red Sox fan. How's your family? And that stands out. For anyone that's had babies in the room, when your babies are born, right, they do an APGAR score, and they do this at every 5 minutes, at birth, at 5, at 10, if I could be wrong. But really, all that is a series of questions that a woman, Dr. APGAR, developed that completely overhauled the way that we care for babies and the way that we treat them when they're born and how we sort them in the system. And what did that cost? It didn't cost really expensive research and patents and all of that stuff. It honestly cost observation and asking questions. Dr. Gwandi also helped put together the WHO surgery checklist, the World Health Organization. And the most interesting question that I thought was there, they were trying to standardize how we do surgeries all around the world to bring complication rates down. And the most interesting question that is asked right there on the checklist that you're surprised that people don't know in the room is, do you know my name? So you have surgeons and anesthesiologists and nurses and all of these people that come together to do a surgery together, yet you assume maybe they're a team, right? Or that they've worked together a ton, but in a lot of cases they've never met. Or it's been a year since they've been on the same case. And so just by having the team in the room go around and say their name and what they do and coordinate in that way, the complication rates drop. So there's very interesting things that happen. So why do I think questions are important? I think that gives you a little taste, but there's so many corners of our life where asking the right questions are important. So of course, creating value by design, when we're working on projects, when we're trying to build something of value, it's important that the information we gather is good, right? But there's some other places where it's interesting. In our relationships. I'm a woman, and I think a lot of times we like to be like, well, I've had a bad day and he didn't ask me the right question, or this and this, and that can, and women rock. So no disparagement there. But I think what happens, I have my sister-in-laws ask me a lot, how is Mark so wonderful? My husband, who I obviously think is wonderful, and who, by the way, lived through the accident. He's up here somewhere. And there's a big piece of that has to do with his wonderfulness, but there's also a big piece of this in that I ask for what I need. And this applies in our relationships, it applies in our jobs. A lot of times when things go wrong, there's simply a point where we don't ask for what we need. Parenting, of course, when you're raising kids and you want to get information out of them, I ask them every day what they had for lunch, what they did at recess, all of these things. I want to get inside their little minds. But some questions work better than others. And then, of course, in business, have we all been in a meeting where someone's been singled out and asked a question that's made them feel small and undervalued and not important, when someone's just looking for information, when that same question could have been asked in a way that made that person feel valued and smart and valuable to the team. And of course, good information gives us great creativity. So here's a couple things that I started to look at from these different perspectives. One is this just shows the difference. So, hey, Mom, look at this. When your child comes and brings you this beautiful piece of art that they've put together, and you're looking and you're like, oh, what is it? And they're like, well, it's a picture of you. Awesome. Now, you get a very different response if you come in and say, tell me about it. And you get all the details you could have ever wanted. Now, just because tell me about it doesn't have a question mark at the end, doesn't mean it's not a question in a way that we're gathering information. But I'm actually asking it in a way that's going to give me so much more information, like, and here's you and your hair, and this is our dog by you, and here's me. And you really get such a different range of information out of just shifting your question asking like that. So again, what makes a good question? So what I did is I went and I asked 10 different types of professions and people that I knew who I thought had really interesting jobs and where questions were really important for them. And I asked them what made a good question or what got them the best information that they needed. The cool part about a lot of these people is we talk about how I do a lot in social media. I would not have met most of these people had I not been involved in social media. So some of these people I've met on Twitter and hence met them in real life, or I've met them at social media conferences or different places like this. So I feel really lucky that I had this pool of people to ask my questions to. So first, I'm actually going to go back and start with a more personal example, just since we're on the kid note, and then I'll jump into all my interesting people. But with kids, I ran into a situation where 2 years ago, I was faced with explaining a lot to my kids about death. So my younger sister died of cancer 2 years ago, and this was their aunt. And I was pregnant at the time, and I had 2 kids. I now have 3. But at the time, I think they were 4 and 6. And they were obviously coming into her room and seeing things that they probably didn't understand, and we knew that my sister wasn't going to make it. And so I asked the hospice worker, I said, how do I explain this to them? What do I tell them? How do I make this digestible and worked out in their little minds? And she said, you know what, they're going to ask you what they're ready to hear. And I had to totally trust that and then meet my kids at that level that they asked me with, with that full amount of information or with something really light and easy. And they asked me some pretty tough questions, so I met them there with full honesty. But I saw it again during my husband's accident. My little girl said, "Mom, will you please send me a picture of Dad wiggling his toes so that I know he's okay?" And she, during his accident, was 6 at the time, and that was all she could take. She didn't want to see his face. She knew that he was in really big trouble. But she knew that if she could just see his toes, that was okay. And so that's what I did. And you see my husband's cute little swollen toes and someone else's foot down in the corner. But she asked me for what she needed. So I went on in kind of this kid vein, and Super Grover, obviously like the best furry blue guy that we've ever met. So he has a whole series on Sesame Street right now all about questions. It's called Grover 2.0, and it's all about Grover asking questions and kind of going through the scientific method. So I wanted to ask Sesame Street why they chose that. Right now, this season, they're focusing on the STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And this is where a lot of people would say the US struggles right now. So I would also say, is it because we're not as curious as we could be? Are we not as engaged in question asking? But what you'll see in Grover's little 2-minute videos, which are hilarious, so you should Google them, is that they're showing Grover, they're teaching the kids curiosity. They're teaching the kids persistence. Grover, of course, asks the wrong question all of the time. And they're teaching them revision. So if Grover is asking the wrong question, he still doesn't have the answer, they're showing that Grover's changing his questions, and he's revising, and he's not stopping until he gets the answer he wants. So the next person I asked was the producer friend I have who's worked at the Oprah show for 19 years, which is just wrapping up. And she's a senior supervising producer, so she works for one of the best question askers out there, right? It's Oprah Winfrey. And she told me some really interesting things about the processes to run the show. So whenever she goes to pitch a show, the question that Oprah asks is, what is your intention? And how often do we ask ourselves this question? What is your intention? So if your intention is to go change the world and change people's minds, and here's your big idea, great, let's talk about that. But also, if your intention is just to do a fun, light show about shoes and dresses, well, great, pitch it to me from that intention. But really, you ask yourselves this question between all of the projects you do, and it's really interesting what answers you get. And in interviewing, a great thing she said was, get past the this is what happened and get to the connection. So people can tell a story, but what Oprah does is she asks how it changed them. You know, what impact did that have on their lives? And then keep questions open-ended and introspective. I have a friend that I met on Twitter who is a CSI investigator. So I asked her, it's @AngryJulie, if any of you would like to follow her. She's a crime scene specialist in San Diego. And the cool thing that she said to me is, you know what, I go to a crime scene and I don't really care how people are answering my questions. I'm a visual investigator. So I'm looking for visual clues all over the place. So I might look at somebody and say, oh, tell me about that bruise you have on your arm. How old is it? No. She's really just trying to draw out random bits of information based on what she's seen rather than rely totally on their experience to give her clues. Again, here's the doctor, Atul Gawande, that I love some of the things that he said in his book. He said, ask an unscripted question. So if you have a job that you feel is monotonous, if you work with people and you feel like it's repetitive, ask an unscripted question. If you ask the random question, the machine feels less like a machine. And then he says, count something. Everyone should be a scientist in this world. So whether you can change things that you can measure, right? You can improve things that you can measure. So counting, and I used to have an accountant that I worked with back in college who would always say this, and I thought it was like the worst thing ever because we always had to fill out reports and do these things. But it turns out really, as someone who owns and runs a business, if you count things, you can change them. So I love that piece. And this is all from his book, Better. So then, of course, I'm going to ask a lawyer how to ask great questions. And I love the answer he gave me. This is someone who shall not be named, because I ran into him in the street, and he said, you're not going to like my answer, but here it is. We are not listeners. We are not interested in getting the truth. We are interested in contorting the record. So interesting, and that is right from the lawyer's mouth. And then I showed someone my slides, and they said, oh, is this like a snake like Voldemort? and that was unintentional. So of course, after the lawyer, I have one of the smartest investors I know that I asked. Because if he worked for a private equity firm, and now he runs his own firm, Guardsman Holdings. And this guy, it's Larry Cook, and if I were to think that he had some sort of psychic abilities, this would be the guy that I think has it. Anything that he says is going to happen, or his gut feeling is always right, no matter when I've been like, oh no, but this is great, or what do you think of this? I've learned to know that he also must have psychic abilities. But the biggest thing that helps him find a good deal or a company he wants to invest in is he watches for this as the red flag. If you ask a question and get an answer to a question other than the one you asked, then you have your answer. And so he said, I've seen so many people so artfully step around and answer a completely different question than the one that I asked, and I can just sit back. I don't even need to ask again because I know what the answer is. It's the one that I didn't want to hear. Okay, so programmers. Do we have any programmers in the audience? Not many. No one. Okay, well, I might beat you up for a minute, but you'll love me at the end. So if anyone's had to work with a programmer, this is where, over the years, we've probably spent more than we should on a lot of the projects we have, because it's uncovering what this communication pattern should be with programmers, how to get to where you both understand what you're doing. So this is a funny cartoon I found. It shows all the different variations of an end product that came because of the communication that was involved. So I love this one. How did the business consultant describe it? You know, it's a lazy boy with lights shooting out of it. When really, at the end of the day, this is all the customer really wanted or needed, but all the communication gave them all these different results. So when I did my Googling, you know, the programmer said, hackers have a reputation for meeting simple questions with what looks like hostility or arrogance. It sometimes looks like we're reflexively rude to newbies and ignorant, but this isn't really true. And I love the way this programmer spelled it out, because it's a little bit of a hostile quote even. So the challenge you have in meeting halfway is finding somebody with social skills who knows how to draw the right information out of you, and you can draw the right information out of them, and work together to find out how your project should run. So I have a programmer that I found that I loved, and these are the tips he gave, but what I love the most, he said, is there's almost always a difference between what a client says they want and what they really need. And that's a process to move through together. And there's the brutality again. Be brutally honest. The designer, he says he gets more out of listening than trying to lead the discussion. So this is Jesse Harding, someone I recently worked with, and it was a great experience, and I wanted to get him to weigh in. So he says, ask for visual cues. When you fail, it becomes about listening all over again. And here's the project we work on. We call it the Babs. That's social media. We host a social media conference called EVO in the summertime, and our theme this year was adventure. So we told him we're thinking balloons. So he kind of started in this direction. We came back and gave him the visual direction to go back here, and he's like, oh, like big ass balloons, I get it. And which we then called the Babs. And this is what we ended with. These are the Babs. And it took one of our logos and really integrated it, and it gave us this perfect, like, very versatile logo that we could work with this year. But honestly, had we just gone off where we were verbally directing him to go, we were headed to Carnival Land, right? But when we could come back in and give some really great examples of what we were looking for, we got to a great end result. And then this is another woman I talked to, Angela Santamero, who founded Blue's Clues, and I love the little cartoon we have that goes with these guys. Blue's Clues was so revolutionary when it came out because it was one of the first shows that stopped and paused, and it asked a question, and then it waited for the kids to answer. And there's this pause, you know, and kids were actually responding. And how revolutionary was that? Now, this is something we as adults all have a problem with, is we'll ask a question, but if it's not the right one, or there's a pause, we'll ask it, or at least I will, 3 or 4 more times in different ways to bridge this silent gap that we're afraid of. We have this fear of giving the space for somebody to answer and letting them digest what you've asked. And so what I love is she said, you know, we taught people to sit down and listen and then ask questions. Hooray, which I thought was great. So this is what I've learned by being curious. You know, I ask people of all shapes and sizes and all walks of life as many questions as I can if I've got time with them, because I've learned the most interesting things. So I would challenge you all to do the same, is just to be curious. So be curious, ask your questions. Millions saw the apple fall, Newton asked why. And if you have any questions for me, there's where you can find me. Thanks.